Good morning, St. John's. Welcome to another edition of Between Two Services. This morning I'm joined by Deacon Emily Cardwell and by Iverson, who's a friend of the parish and has been attending and worshiping with us during his residency with the Kentucky Historical Society, right?
Yes.
And Ian is a professional historian, comes to us with a lot of gifts, resources, knowledge, and experience. And we thought, as St. John's is wont to do, hey, the Holy Spirit has put these resources in our midst. Let's faithfully ask Ian to do some work for us. And he's agreed to do so very generously so that we can explore some additional facets of our 175th anniversary. Of course, this year we've really lifted up some big themes. We've highlighted the Queen and her visit, some other memorable moments in St. John's history. But we also want to be truthful about who we are as a parish and about the full scale of our history. And of course, as a congregation founded in 1847, that meant we were before the Civil War, which raised some questions about what was the antebellum, the pre-Civil War history of St. John's, and particularly what were the connections that St. John's had with the institution of slavery. And that was a question that we've been prayerfully discerning all year, and thanks to Ian and some of the research background that he brings to this congregation, we've been able to uncover some things. So we're going to do 2 episodes on this theme and really just try to share with the parish some of what we've found and then kind of discern together possible next steps so that we're telling the full story of our church. Ian, I know you're new to the parish. Could you talk a little bit about your background, training, anything you want to share with untold people on the internet?
Sure. As you said, I've been working for the last few months with Kentucky Historical Society on their Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition project. I'm trained as a scholar of early America, with a specific focus on the mid-19th century. So working in the antebellum period is kind of my specialty. I guess in terms of formal degrees, I have a BA from Princeton University and an MA and a PhD from the University of Virginia.
Yeah. Really, just, you are quite a slacker, right? Thank you for meeting with us and sharing with us and for being part of the St. John's family during this special year together. I thought it might be good for us to first address the question of why do this research, right? And I know, Emily, you've done some real discernment on this work. And then I'm wondering, Ian, if you might share about why looking at the full history of an institution like St. John's is important, and maybe talk about if you've done this kind of work elsewhere. Because that is, I think, inevitably a question that we get. It's long ago, can't change the past, is it worth bringing up again? I would say yes, but I'm curious as to know how you all are thinking.
I think it's very important to look at it, even though it's part of our history. Our history has helped shape us. And often we think of our history as all these grand old things that we did, and our institution is just this wonderful, following of Christ with all the good things of Christ. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. I think it's important that we look at the good and the bad with our history so that hopefully we're always growing closer to Christ instead of away from him and Jesus' mandates.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, I think for any institution, whether that be a church or a school or a civic organization, it's important to know sort of the foundations of that organization and what principles it was built on, and how that may have influenced its trajectory. And so I've done work very similar to this at the University of Virginia. For the last decade or so, the university has been uncovering its relationship with slavery, and unfortunately, the university itself was built by enslaved labor, and its kind of basic functions up through the Civil War were fulfilled by enslaved workers. And so understanding that helps to understand the university's racial dynamic after the war, and also how the tenets of the curriculum developed. It influenced how legal education operated in Virginia, and there are a number of very influential attorneys who went on to positions of prominence within the federal courts that were shaped by this interaction with slavery at the university. And so I think doing the same for churches, whether on the parish or diocesan level, is really important.
Right. And of course, Emily, I mean, this feeds into some of the larger work that the Episcopal Church is doing to build beloved community.
Right.
Is that something that you could talk to us about?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The Episcopal Church, our national church, has as its vision becoming beloved community. One of the priority missions is that of racial reconciliation. And there's a long-term commitment to racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. And I am reading a lot of this. I don't want to miss anything. Several programs have been created, and one of the ones that St. John's members, a bunch of us, have participated in is Sacred Ground. And it's a wonderful program on a racial dialogue series. From that series, we learn as Christians that we are far from Jesus' mandates to love your neighbor as yourself. And we're also far from the baptismal covenant, where we respect the dignity of all human beings. With that program, we're made aware very clearly that racism is a sin, and treating another race as less than the dominant race is a sin. We recently had a joint clergy conference with the Diocese of Kentucky, our Diocese of Lexington, and we had a guest speaker, which was the Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers, where she came to speak about truth and telling the story of racism in our churches. And Canon Spellers is from our presiding Bishop Curry's office. So with that, if we look at racism as a sin, there's a very interesting quote from the Reverend Stephen Phelps, which I just wanted to share. It's rather lengthy, but I think it kind of gets us on the right trajectory. He says, "Sin is always a type of mistake, wherein the word take needs to be heard aloud. Consider," he says, "to live, every animal must take things, but only the human animal can mistake things. Whenever we take what is not rightly offered, we mistake. Sin is this mistaking of land, of labor, of the bodies of men and women, boys and girls, and their lives and honor and trust. Mistaking is driven by greed." And he says, beginning from the 1452 edict of Pope Nicholas V, which blessed explorers to sail the seas and enslave and despoil in the name of Jesus every people they met. And he goes on to say, in short, greed drove out the biblical promptings of grace and peace, once inscribed in ancestral memory. So from our clergy conference that we had, the joint clergy conference, each Episcopal church has been charged by Bishop Mark within our diocese, and again in the Diocese of Kentucky, to begin the steps to tell the truth about our individual churches in regards to our history and any ties we might have with racism. So that's kind of where we find ourselves at this point, and we have this incredible blessing of Ian in our midst, who's been able to do some wonderful kind of first steps for us that were just very not necessarily surprising to find, but just very it sort of just took you back and made you just pause and discern and realize we've got some work to do.
Amen. So let's begin. All right, so we're back. We're going to utilize some Zoom video so that we can do some screen sharing. And I've asked Ian to walk us through some historical research and to kind of situate this conversation in the context of what was the situation in Woodford County, in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. So, Ian, thank you, and take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Father Dana. So, as many of you, I'm sure, know, Kentucky was a slaveholding state in the antebellum period. As a slaveholding state in the Upper South, it was more economically diverse than states further to the South. There was no cotton cultivation in Kentucky, but there was, especially in the Central Bluegrass, kind of staple plantation agriculture, specifically around hemp. And Woodford County, in particular, was known for its significant hemp production, and um, that agricultural activity required vast amounts of enslaved labor. So here is a map made at the beginning of the Civil War, which charts the density of the enslaved population across the slaveholding states, and you can see already that Woodford County jumps out. So Woodford County, actually within Kentucky, is the only county in Kentucky where a majority of the population in 1860 was enslaved. So this is based off of data from the 1860 census. So you can see here 52.5% of the population of Woodford County was enslaved. That's higher, but on par with some of the other counties in the Central Bluegrass. You can see Fayette is just under a majority of 45.7%, but contrasting it to kind of the mountain country in Eastern Kentucky, where you have places where less than 2% of the population was enslaved. So that gives you some idea as to what was going on in this region, both economically and then demographically. So to say a little bit about the research methodology that I employed when looking into the history of St. John's, I was relying principally on the same census records that you saw that helped to make that map. So information for the 1850 and 1860 censuses displayed not only everyone who was living in the county, every white person who was living in the county, but also kept track of enslaved individuals as to who legally owned them and their age. So we're able to trace those white parishioners of St. John's who held people in bondage and the age and sex of those individuals. And so you can see an example of what these slave schedules look like. I can share my screen again.
I think when you first mentioned slave schedules, I don't know why. First off, I was completely naive. I had no idea that Woodford County would be the heart of slaveholding in Kentucky. And second, I mean, I guess I was also naive that it didn't dawn on me that there would actually be official records, like a registry, literally a registry of slaves and ownership. But then when I sat back and reflected, I thought, well, of course, I mean, with like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, they would have needed to know what the slave population actually was for sort of representation in Congress, etc. So
exactly. And so here you can see individuals listed. So these are the white owners. So here Joseph C. Carter, who was a parishioner at St. John's. We can see those he enslaved listed next to him, and we only see their ages and their sex. And this B or M is whether they're listed as black or for the period term mulatto, so mixed race. So here, most of his enslaved people are actually mixed race, but you see M for male and F for female. And so this line represents a 38-year-old man. And you can see going down, many of those that he enslaves are children. So we see likely twins, 2 5-year-olds, 2 3-year-olds, 2 4-month-year-olds, but reaching all the way to the elderly, or elderly for the period, a 65-year-old woman here. And this is roughly the same throughout. And just so that you all know that I am in fact basing this in where we are. Here we are, slave inhabitants in District Number 2 of Woodford County, state of Kentucky, enumerated August 2nd, 1850.
Wow.
So
3 years after St. John's was officially established. And of course, I think Dr. Carter wasn't just a member. I think he was actually, wasn't he an original vestry member at St. John's?
he was an original member of the vestry.
And so obviously that's a deep connection, to our parish that, as we think about how you have to found a church, you have to be you're starting really from nothing. You have to acquire property, you have to build a building, you have to seek a minister. You don't have an organ, you don't have pews, you don't have prayer books. You have to be able to acquire all of that. And so really, I'm guessing that it wouldn't be a stretch to say that enslaved labor provided some of the startup capital for St. John's as a parish.
Yeah, I think based on my findings, it's not unfair to say that St. John's early years were funded by slave labor.
That's all
It's a lot
right.
to take in.
That's a lot to take in. I was it's interesting, like the different reactions to this, because we've shared with the broader 175th committee that we were starting to look into this. And you know to me, I'm interested in history. I don't think I'm uneducated in any way, not a specialist by any means, but even looking into this, I'm like, oh wow, like one's own obliviousness stares you in the face. And I've had some people say, well, what did you expect to find? Right? We were in the South, we were prominent, we had prominent members. And um, and yet there's still something very visceral when you think about, here's a registry of children that were enslaved by members of our parish. Um, like when you move from the abstract to the concrete, I think it does bring about a greater sense of awareness. I don't know, Emily, if you have any thoughts to share.
I'd just like to say, and I know I did share this with both you, Father Dana and Ian, but with my learning through Sacred Ground, which I learned an incredible amount about, just kind of history and things, and like you, I had heard, oh well, we probably have slavery in our history as St. John's, and my first reaction when Ian shared some of the information with us was like, oh, the truth is going to be told. And then not even 5 minutes later, it was like, oh my gosh, this is real.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people just would be quick to dismiss it and say, well, this was long ago. This was the mentality. This was the mindset. But that's not what we're called to do.
Right.
And it's not that we want to make ourselves feel bad, but I think we also have to speak the truth, which is what Canon Spellers was talking about, and say, we weren't quite doing what Jesus mandated. And, people will have in there that, well, but slavery was in the Bible. And, I was even reading a little bit more today, and I was like, slavery is in the Bible, but, if you were a Hebrew slave, there was specific treatments, and they themselves were, asked to become slaves to pay off debts. It wasn't like they were captured. And then even with captured slaves, in the Bible, you were still supposed to treat the alien and the traveler kindly. You were not supposed to, treat them like animals, which unfortunately is what so much of slavery is about. And, we learned that in the Sacred Ground, that it wasn't these rosy tales of, slaves singing along and having these white people look after them and, and care for them. That's not what it was. And if we have that version of history in our mind, that's not doing justice to the people who came before us. And I even mentioned to you, Father Dana and Ian, about, when we think about people coming to worship on Sunday, and back then, when we got it right, the wagons, horse-drawn wagons would be out there. There were probably slaves that drove those wagons to bring their masters to church. And like I said, it's not to make us feel bad or to look down on them, because as we learned at the clergy conference, and there was a program prior to that the night before, this was mandated that, it was okay to have slaves. and a bishop, the bishop from Kentucky, I believe it was, or no, it was the dean of the cathedral, wrote a pamphlet that is just unbelievable to hear even just bits of it about how
Right.
it was okay to have slaves. So it's amazing to me how far away the church as an institution got away from Jesus's teachings. And I think that's where we need to go is, you know, look at our history, sit with it, reflect on it. You know, what have we learned? Hopefully we've learned a lot. And where do we go from here?
Well, I think that's important to lift up because, of course, St. John's predates the establishment of the Diocese of Lexington. So we were part of the Diocese of Kentucky, which was notable in the United States for some passionate defenses of slavery as an institution. And, so we're connected in that legacy as well, not just like begrudging slaveholders or slaveholders who that was the economic reality of the time, but actually people who knew the arguments against it were presented
Right.
with the arguments of abolitionists and then enthusiastically sought to counter them. I mean, that is also part of our legacy, that we're not just connected to some people who were minor slaveholders. We were connected to people who were gung-ho enslavers.
Right. Right. And I think that's what bothers isn't the right word, but I'm clergy now,
Yeah,
and this is what clergy were preaching,
yeah.
teaching.
Ian, did you want to jump in here and add any?
Yeah, I guess just to add that the Episcopal Church throughout the South was guilty of this. Some of the most influential pro-slavery tracts, which were distributed widely throughout the country, were written by Episcopal clergymen. One that comes to mind is Albert T. Bledsoe, who wrote essentially a treatise called Liberty and Slavery, which refuted abolitionist arguments point by point. I can
Oh my.
share screen again briefly. So we have deemed it wise and proper to notice only the more decent, respectable, and celebrated among the abolitionists of the North. Those scurrilous writers who deal in the wholesale abuse of Southern character we have deemed unworthy of notice. In replying to others, we are conscious that we have often used strong language, for which, however, we have no apology to offer.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I was just going to add, I don't mean to hog the spotlight, but with all this, there's no definite way forward either, for different churches and in different places where people are at. And Bishop Mark, he said he appreciated me pointing this out to all the clergy, but yet he's caught on record or recording when he was speaking. The night Canon Speller spoke as well, that even the bishops don't know what to do in regards to all this, because when they sold Mission House, he wanted to, and it sounded great, give some of the proceeds to go for reparations. And he called Canon Spellers up and says, okay, we're going to donate some of this money. She goes, no, you're not. You're going to do the work first. And even Bishop White, he wanted to do something thinking it was in the right vein. And she's like, nope, you need to do the work first. So I think we've got some work ahead.
Okay, we took a break there for a moment, but we're back with Deacon Emily and with Dr. Ian Iverson, and are talking about some of the findings, because we had gotten together and we had to start somewhere. So we looked at the parish records and found the names of the original founding members of the vestry, and also looked through the nave to find names of prominent people who were adults during the antebellum period, and made a list of names. And Ian, could you share with us what you found beyond Dr. Carter that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, so as you said, we looked at the original parish vestry and those prominent members who are featured in the sanctuary, and that came out to 18 names. And of those, I was able to find 11 that were directly connected to slavery through basically searching for one afternoon. So that does not mean that the 7 that I didn't find connections to were not involved. It just means that the records aren't maybe sufficient with the sort of limited digital resources that I was able to use. But I was employing those population and slave schedules that I shared with you earlier, and from those, I was able to find out kind of the following about each of these people. So John Amsden, who's featured very prominently, stained glass window, beautiful stained glass window, and right behind the altar, owned 3 enslaved people in 1850, 1 man and 2 women, ranging in age from 13 to 30 years old. William P. Hart, another founding member, owned 27 enslaved people in 1850, which included 14 men and 13 women, ranging in age from 4 months to 75 years old. In 1860, Hart had acquired even more enslaved people. He owned 34 people, 19 men and 15 women, and they ranged in age from 1 to 67 years old. Another early member who is featured prominently on another stained glass window, on a plaque in the sanctuary, Edith Sanders Hunter, in 1860 was married to Abner C. Hunter, who owned 2 enslaved men, one 36 years old and one 42 years old. As I said earlier, Dr. Carter owned 20 enslaved people in 1850, 12 men and 8 women, ranging in age from 4 months to 65 years old. And he continued to hold enslaved people through 1860. The census records indicate that he had 12 enslaved people at the time, meaning that he likely sold off some of the people that he had previously owned for money that may have gone to St. John's. But of those 12 people, 8 were men, 4 were women, and they ranged in age from 1 to 80 years old. Another, Joseph D. Helm, owned 15 enslaved people in 1850, 10 men, 5 women. They ranged in age from 2 to 52 years old. In 1860, Helm owned 16 people, 9 men and 7 women, and they ranged in age from 9 to 60 years old. Moving further down the list, Caleb B. Henry enslaved 3 people in 1840, 1 man and 2 women. In 1850, he owned 5 enslaved people. And that included 1 man and 4 women, ranging in age from 1 to 55 years old. Joseph B. Kincaid was another founding member of the parish, and in 1860 he owned 3 people, 2 women and a man, ranging in age from 28 to 50. Another original member of the vestry, who was a clergyman actually over in Frankfurt, but he was a friend to St. John's and helped get the parish going. Reverend John N. Norton owned 5 enslaved people in 1860, 3 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 11 to 40 years old. Another prominent member of the parish, George T. Cotton, was directly connected through his household. Sometimes property relations can get a little complicated, and so but while the records didn't indicate that he owned any enslaved people, he lived within a household where his elderly relative Elizabeth Taylor owned in 1850 12 enslaved people, 5 men and 7 women, ranging in age from 1 to 45. And then by 1860, she owned 30 enslaved people, 16 men and 14 women, ranging in age from 6 months to 70 years old. Dr. Thornhill W. Twyman, another prominent early member.
I don't know if he was a member. I think we sent some names that were connected to the Hughes House property, which actually yes, on the historic registry as the Reddy Twyman House, and because that's also a piece for our parish as we think about the history of that property. That house being even older as a structure than St. John's and our building, has deep connections to slavery, which also might factor into, as we have ongoing discernment about, what the future of that property is. I think it is important for people to realize that it it has a strong connect. I mean, it in all likelihood was built by enslaved labor and maintained by enslaved labor and was paid for by enslaved labor. So let's let's share what you found about two prominent previous owners of that property.
Yeah. So Dr. Timon in 1860 owned 10 enslaved people, 8 men and 2 women, between 12 and 54 years old. And Peter Yeager, another individual connected with that property a little bit earlier, back in 1850, also owned 10 enslaved people, 7 men and 3 women, ranging in age from 5 to 38.
Again, that's a lot to take in. I know if anybody's just hearing this for the first time, because you've been very kind to share it with us, so we've sort of had a little bit of time to digest a bit of this, but for anybody hearing it for the first time, I know it just, you just kind of have to sit with it.
Yeah. I think it's telling. I think every time the mention of children pops up, I mean, I don't know why, but that gets me every time. It's like, you just, 6 months old, 1 year old, and I also think something that you highlighted earlier, Ian, was something that is sensitive, and we want to be careful about how we talk about it, but it is also part of the history, and that is, if most of these enslaved people are recorded as multiracial, then obviously, in addition to all of the other deprivations of slavery that were being practiced at that time, the brutality, the theft of labor, the lack of freedom, the denial of personhood, we also have to reckon with the fact that there was a tremendous amount of sexual violence going on as well. Because if you're not legally a person, you can't legally consent or not. So, yeah, we've just barely, I mean, we've just taken out the name of the first vestry and some names that are on our nave, and we've already stumbled in, and some names connected to an adjacent property, and we've already stumbled into a whole host of sensitive issues. So if we wanted to continue this work, because again, we've just scratched the surface. We haven't looked at the membership rules for the whole parish. We have those. So there are additional names that we could look into. We also have any number of vessels we looked only at names that are affixed to the structure with plaques, but when we also, or stained glass windows, but when we also look at things like offering plates, processional crosses, baptismal fonts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a lot of this stuff is quite old and was donated to people who were adults pre-Civil War, or in memory of people who were adults before the Civil War. So we could probably easily come up with another 18 names to start investigating. How would we, if we were a parish and wanted to look into that, how would we go about, what is the best, easiest way of going about this work as sort of non-trained historians?
Yeah, so the best way to go about it would be to look into the slave schedules, but in order to make the best use of those slave schedules, you would want to look at the census, the population schedules, which include free white individuals. And so resources like Ancestry.com allow you to search specific censuses, so you can search the 1850 and 1860 census down to the county level. They're not perfect. A lot of names end up being mistranscribed. But if you search for a surname in the 1850 or 1860 census, you'll be able to pull up that household. From there, you can identify who's identified as the head of household, and that'll usually be the person who will be listed in the slave schedule as the owner. And then you'd be able to search that. There's a separate search tab. And actually, the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules on Ancestry.com are free to the public. Anyone can search them. You don't have to have a subscription. To see the population schedules, which again is a sort of a best practice, you would want to search through as well. But you can search a name, and it will it'll pull up any matches. An alternative, and is what's probably a best practice, would be to go through each census page by page. It would be a substantial amount of work, but certainly not impossible if there was a team of people who were interested in doing it. We're talking about dozens, or at most kind of hundreds of census pages, not thousands. So
we do have people who's expressed interest, yes.
So, and that would allow us to kind of catch any mistranscriptions or kind of other flaws in the Ancestry.com algorithm. Because as I kind of mentioned, it's a good start, and it was able to, find these 11 out of the 18, but I suspect that at least a couple more of those 18 might have connections that that the algorithm wasn't pulling up, but it was kind of time prohibitive to search through the entire census for Woodford County or the adjacent counties, because that's the other things we would want to expand the search out a little bit more.
Right. So if people owned slaves, and though they were primarily housed in adjacent counties,
they would be listed on that slave schedule.
So really what we've done is we've established kind of like a very, very low floor here for our total slave. I mean, like even with the 11 names that we've identified, it could be substantially higher. And, if they...
Depending on where they held property, and those property records are a little bit harder to access. They're I guess they're spottier, but we would be able to, if you were willing to search in Fayette and Franklin and other places, you'd be turning up more.
Okay. The other thing that I think that was important that you lifted up was that you talked about how within families, sort of financial arrangements are complicated. You kind of came across one of those. I think that's also important for us as we sort of do the work to also look at, how our household's structured and who's the property in the name of, and things, and those kind of considerations.
Within multi-generational households, which are pretty common in this period, it's usually the oldest person has the property in their name, and that could be a man or a woman, and some people are surprised by that. But yeah, so you need to be careful about not dismissing or not writing somebody off just because their name doesn't immediately appear in the slave schedule. That's why you want to look at the population schedule to see who's in their household, and does the household own enslaved people.
Right. So getting back to like our Christian principle of, wanting to be truth tellers, wanting to really examine this history in an appropriate way. I think there's also some of our work is to make sure that we are acknowledging the full humanity of enslaved people. And, I mentioned earlier, like when you think of the children, like, I mean, that just gets me, so we have the census records that list all of the free white people in the county. How is there a way, how would we go about learning the names? Because I notice in the slave schedules, they don't list names. Is there a way for us to start working on kind of restructuring essentially giving people names, because John Amsden has a name. I mean, he's going to name on stained glass and any number of other things in St. John's. He's going to name on a building downtown. Like, his name is known. How could we find out about the people who essentially had their lives stolen from them in order to enrich Amsden and his family? And I'm not trying to be overly judgmental, but a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is, and that's what it is. So how would we go about learning their names?
So that unfortunately is a little bit trickier. So I guess there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the children's names are the easiest to recover because they will be listed in birth records from the 1850s. Prior to that, the records are really spotty, but enslaved children are generally recorded, oftentimes with a first name in county birth records. So you'll find what you'll basically get is a whole list of anyone who was born in, say, 1853. And that you'll have white children's names, and there you'll have the child's full name and their father and their mother. For enslaved children, you'll have, usually there's a big letter B next to it, or an M for black or mulatto. It's usually just a first name, and then it's the name of the owner. But those are searchable on platforms like Ancestry.com as well. And while I didn't find any of those connected to those 11 individuals, I would be very surprised if we couldn't find some as we broaden out. Beyond that, it starts to get a little bit trickier. The 1870 census does list everyone who lived in Woodford County, both black and white. And so you would be able to potentially track down some formerly enslaved people and find their names through that resource, but it's hard to know who was who. The best case scenario is sort of looking at people who either remained with their former enslavers and continued to work as field hands or domestic servants, and you would get their names. Or if you'll oftentimes see formerly enslaved individuals. Oftentimes they changed their surname, but sometimes they retained their former owner's surname, and that would be a one way. And that's, as I've been exploring this just a little bit, you can find actually I found several people that may have joined the Union Army during enslaved individuals who joined the Union Army during the Civil War from Woodford County that have these same surnames as some of our prominent parishioners. And the process of emancipation in Kentucky was very complicated and very messy, and it involved a lot of self-emancipation where enslaved people would run off and join the Union Army, and that made you free. And those records, those muster rolls are still extant and are searchable.
I'm also thinking, like, there's so much history here, and it just seems like we're getting into it, but then there's so much more to look into, because I'm thinking, so one of the reasons why I initially didn't expect to find as much slaveholding in Woodford County as what we found is it blows me away that the population of Woodford County was so heavily enslaved in 1850, because when you look at the census data, from the 2020 census, we are today a county that's 92% white, which also lends itself to the question of how does a county go from being 54% or 52%, a majority enslaved in 1850 or 1860 to 92% white. I mean, so we've also got to start looking at the history of this community through Reconstruction and Jim Crow. I mean, because that is also, like, nothing happens in a vacuum. One thing leads to another. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Kentucky was particularly inhospitable to freed people in the aftermath of the war. Kentucky, because it officially remained loyal to the Union throughout the war, and that's contested. There were rival governments, one Union, one Confederate, but because it had never, a majority of the state hadn't sided with the Confederacy, and as a result, it never underwent federal Reconstruction, and so Union troops left the state pretty quickly. which made it a pretty miserable place to be a recently freed person, more so than even places in the Deep South. And that changed over time, but you did see a lot of migration out of places like Woodford County, kind of as soon as the war ended, towards places where there was more economic opportunity and also more social freedom. So a lot of formerly enslaved people headed north of the Ohio River and clustered in places like Cincinnati, where there were established free African American communities with sort of the institutional infrastructure to help them. But it's a really complicated story, and this is not something that I've researched extensively, but there are a number of good works of scholarship that I would happily point anyone who is interested in learning more to.
This is big in terms of next steps. Ian, is there anything else about your research or sort of your history that you would want to share with St. John's as we begin to hold these conversations?
I suppose just my advice to anyone undertaking this work is to be diligent and to go through the records slowly, because it's easy to miss things. Especially if names are, the census takers are oftentimes themselves mishearing names, and so you'll see an alternative spelling, or you'll see initials rather than a full name, and so you just need to to really have your eyes peeled as you're going through these sorts of records, because it's easy to overlook something. And then if you're using the digital resource, if you're using Ancestry itself, don't trust the algorithm. It's a good first resource, but it's not it's not gospel truth. So even if
confirm it through a couple sources.
Right.
Understood. Thank you.
Oh.
Okay. All right, so I just have part of a commissioning prayer that we use for Sacred Ground. It's adapted from Dr. Yolanda Pierce, and it's just points to remember as we go about any looking into racial history. Do not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Do not rush to offer a Band-Aid when the gaping wound requires surgery and complete reconstruction. Do not offer false equivalencies, thereby diminishing the particular pain being felt in a particular circumstance, in a particular historical moment. Do not speak of reconciliation without speaking of reparations and restoration, or how we can repair the breach and how we can restore the loss. Do not value property over people. Let us not protect material objects while human lives hang in the balance. Do not value a false peace over a righteous justice. And finally, do not be afraid to sit with the ugliness, the messiness, and the pain that is life and community together.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ian. We're grateful for your work, and thank you, Emily, for your diligent leadership on racial reconciliation and building beloved community.
You're welcome.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.